Hi, just a quick one. If you have any questions, please use slido.com and the code for the screening is just on the screen. I believe Anam Abbas will join us on screen. Hi, Anam. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hello, salam, adab. I'm so pleased to be here with you guys.
And at the minute?
Yes, I'm in Rawalpindi, Pakistan.
Great, cool. I just want to quickly say thank you for sharing with us like images that continue to show resilience and perseverance for justice. Especially in this time, and a lot of things has happened, and it's great to see that. Maybe we could just start from a very simple question. Why did you decide to film the Arat March?
I was involved with the Earth March since 2018, where it started in Karachi and was replicated in Lahore and Islamabad. And I was helping out with video because that's what I do with the march. And so the archive started building from 2018. And by the time we were planning the 2020 March, months before, it just, there was a lot of conversation on national media about who the marchers were and who were funding them, and a lot of paranoia. And I think it was very important to demystify what the process of putting something up like this up was and who these women are, but also to archive it. It was, my personal experience with these women, with this community, and being an attendee of the march was so important to me and so like paradigm shifting for me that it became it became very clear that this was a movement and a moment that needed to be archived.
I mean, you're not the only one filming. You had a multiple camera person, I would say. So like maybe you can talk about how you collate and make. Was this were you just getting if you just want to talk about how you chose those people who were filming, was this part of like, oh, the filmmaking process, or was it actually because they were attending the march? And also kind of like how you visited those archives to kind of make this story out of it.
Most of the film is like nests itself in the 2020 March. And so that was, I moved back to Karachi, where I'd been living for work in 2018, and began filming very purposely for this film. But, starting in 2018, there was just a lot of women filmmakers who, like, the Samab is a British Pakistani filmmaker who contributed. My band was performing that year at the march, and so I had somebody just come and shoot the performance with the march itself. So there was just various reasons for the archive to assemble. And then for Karachi, I knew I was following multiple characters, and so and it was very important to see the march from those multiple angles and from those different perspectives. And so there was women who are colleagues and who are part of the documentary community here who volunteered at that time to film and sort of embed with themselves with different characters. And then when I was at the edit, it was because it was, once you're part of the community, you're part of these, like, everything happens on WhatsApp groups. So it was very easy to connect to other cities and be like, I'm making this film. I want all the cities to be represented. And everybody had been documenting. We're also living in a sort of culture where we document everything. So it wasn't hard to collect those archives post March as well.
Great. And but you made all the decision on your own in terms of what the materials you were going to use, and none of them were involved in that process.
Yeah, the edit was very insular for sure. It is such a huge community that, there's like maybe 50 or 60 women in each city that are organizing. But I was working with Omar Majid, who edited the film, and it was great to have him bring in a sort of more holistic perspective of the march, because being so close to something also makes you sometimes really get lost in the weeds, and because there's so many intricacies that you're privy to, and so it was it was a conversation between me and Omar for the most part.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask also about your choice of focusing intergenerational conversation in the film, because you focused on the young, but you also focused on some older generation. And yeah, so maybe if you can talk about that relationship a little bit.
The march, the Earth March, the women who conceived it and are sort of the foot soldiers are younger women, and I think it's just about the energy it takes to do this marathon of organizing. But the greater community is still intergenerational, right? And there's a, I think in the film, I hope there is a sense of women uplifting each other, or people who are a little bit more have been more ingrained in sort of an activist leftist space or for years versus people who are just entering into it, and how that range of experience and the range of like being totally exhausted versus being really excited and full of hope and full of possibility. Like you need all of that. You need all of that energy to conceive of, like, to imagine new things for these movements.
I think the most interesting part is like the film also becomes a movement where you included animation and archive, and then obviously having real life event, and kind of maybe if you can, and I feel that was also an somehow a intergenerational like conversation. The animation was kind of very fable like, and then you have the archive that of course it becomes from a past. And so maybe if you can talk about your choices of having animation and archive in the film as well.
Yeah. So that the prologue, the archive in the prologue, I mean that in some ways that's particularly to situate the film in our history of resistance, right? So I think internationally there's a sense of, and there's this propaganda which is used for warfare, right? Of like Muslim women need to be saved, and there's obviously a huge step away from that now in the recent years, but that's something that we have witnessed in the past, war of terror age, where victimized Muslim women who need to be saved were used as a tool to wage war, an excuse to wage war and colonial expansion and colonial violence. So for me, it was very important. And then for like a Pakistani audience, the sort of nationalistic patriarchal propaganda is that these women are westernized, or they're sort of like a fringe group that has nothing to do with Pakistani culture. And then so that prologue is really important for me to sort of situate the audience and like, no, that's not true. We obviously have a very deep rooted indigenous history of women's resistance and women in resistance movements, right? Whether it was independence or it's student groups or uh, other leftist movements. And then the animation was, I think, represents a little bit of my own um, the way I see this history and the current moment. And it was inspired by a tarot reading that a feminist artist, Sarah Malkani, did for the march. I think a day or like a night before the march was happening, because there was tensions were high. We were worried about security. There's just so much going on, and that was something that was like a breather for us. And what the tarot sort of indicated is something I really related to, which is a sense of beginnings, but also a sense of these struggles are continuous, and so I felt that that was a good bracket for the very specific moment that the film is in.
Thank you. I mean, I'm actually going to jump to a question from the audience because you talk about security. And the question is from Leslie Brennan. And it says, do you ever feel threatened in the work that you do? If so, by whom?
Um, I mean, I think for me personally, as a filmmaker, most threats are online. There's just a lot of trash talk. But for the organizers, there's always people on the front lines, right? There's so many women who organize, but there's always people who are on the front lines, and for them, security is, they take the hit. And so for this year, there was, there's so many videos from the march that were doctored by these right-wing groups in order to like be able to take legal action or to incite violence against women. And I think they targeted, one from Karachi, one from Islamabad, or was it just two women were targeted for these intense campaigns, right? Because they can't, there's thousands of women coming out onto the streets, and so what do? You try to find somebody to scapegoat, so that everybody falls back. So I think, I mean, you secure yourself and you're smart and you think about the long game, but you also understand that when these things happen, it's because you're gaining ground, right? So these are fear responses from the other side, and so it's a sign of a win in some ways.
I think that was kind of interesting. It's actually my next question about your decision to include the oppositions in the screening, because you didn't just focus on the organizers and the organizing. You also showed how the opposition was strongly against, and especially to it, like where it was the woman, like on the front line also going against each other. And maybe if you kind of talk a bit more of the situation then when you were filming as well, it would be interesting.
Yeah, so it's a ideological battle, right? And it's not men versus women. It's patriarchy and capitalism versus a different vision for the world. So um, I think that what I wanted to capture was culture shift, and I like to think of culture as this like skin, and if you stretch it, there will be like holes will appear, and then through those punctures, like those punctures can be violent, but they can also be full of possibility. So there's a clip of the women from Lal Masjid, which is like the extreme right? Like they're like, yay, ISIS, like they're those people. And even they are sort of like, even they are, in that interview, if you watch the longer one, the journalist is very sort of pushing them. And even she has to admit that, yes, there are problems, right? That even within the right, very conservative Islamic culture or subgroup that she's part of, that she talks about inheritance and how women don't get their and the inheritance that's due to them by Sharia law, right? And so I think there's a lot of like little interesting things to learn about the fault lines of the culture when you see these groups like in ideological opposition.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely frame a lot of fragility, and the one thing I really was wondering if you can also talk about was the fragility of organizing, right? That you focus, a lot of the time we see people at the front line, organizing this community grassroots level marches, that people tend to forget how much labor it is. And I really kind of specifically, like, I was thinking about Lila, where she got so, like, she was in a bad mood, and the march that she's organized for so long, and I kind of, maybe if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I love Layla. Bless you, Layla. Yeah, the Islamabad March is, I don't know how much the film is able to detail this, but the Islamabad March is largely put together by the Women's Democratic Front, which is a leftist group, and many of the women are active in other leftist groups like the Awami Workers' Party or the Pashtun Tahaffus movement. So these are very, very these movements are huge threats to the state in many ways. And Islamabad also is a more conservative place, right? For many reasons. Like Karachi city was there providing security, Lahore provided security, Islamabad just stood back and let that happen, right? And these are like, and that violence happened from groups that are at the edge of being banned organizations. So I'm sure they're under surveillance by the state. So and so I think, so those affiliations of Lela, I think perhaps felt more devastated by what happened because that's her sisterhood, right? Or that's a world that she's more in tune with. versus, but then at the same time, it's not that Muniza is not empathetic to that. It's just her head was just in keeping that house together at that point, right? Like, just scrambling to make sure things are running on schedule and stuff. So it's yeah, it's everyone is bearing their burdens.
Yeah. One question from the audience: what is the potential or plan to screen the film in Pakistan?
I made this film for a Pakistani audience primarily. It's for us. I do not feel comfortable with virtual screenings because there's again like the sort of social media footage from the march was doctored, and so I feel like virtual screenings can be a bit insecure. But as soon as things open up, yeah, I'm working with the organizers to come up with ways that we can use this film to talk to students, go to universities, use it for as an organizing tool in areas where that works. And I'm also sort of to continue the archiving process. The film starts. We're almost live with a web-based archive that archives a lot of the posters and art, because a lot of this work is also online, right? The march just becomes sort of the peak where visibly everybody's together. But months before that, and that's something also that's not really visible in the film, is like the teams of women who are doing activism and putting out information online. Like they're putting out booklets and like legal resources, like so much of that work. And so part of the way the film will travel is also through building this archive.
Great. There, another question from the audience is: compared with the energy of the marches and their active preparation, the film title seems quite pessimistic. Could you explain the reference to the past?
I mean, it's from a Fez poem, which sort of talks about, I believe, the promise of Pakistan, and I don't think it's pessimistic. I think that all beginnings are difficult, and that all struggles are difficult, and things, and that's part of being human beings, and that's part of being like this alive. I think, the more like being engaged in these struggles, you're vibrating, I think, on a very different level, and there's equivalent sometimes amounts of pain and brutality that you experience, but then the the affirmations you receive from the world are equally beautiful.
Beautifully put. I was just wondering then, what do you hope the global audience would take away from the film?
I mean, we're experiencing a moment where so many struggles are connected, and so this is you know part of that connection, and throwing our story into the mix. So I hope, hope and resilience, and the idea that we're all in this together, and then maybe connection, right? I would love, part of the way we want this film to travel is to connect with other feminist groups, especially in South Asia, and use this as a tool to build solidarity across struggles and across feminist groups.
A collective solidarity is super important these days, and I couldn't agree more to share the energy together. Just my last question then, Annam, is: do you have any updates of the organizers who has been placed in the exit control list?
I think that was a sort of bullying scare strategy. So she's not in the country right now. So it's, again, like a lot of it is just bullying. She's good. I think there's a lot of obviously conversation about what 2022 will look like, and under, because the strategies from the other side keep tightening. But it's probably going to be around October, November till everybody starts panicking about what they're going to do for the March. Um, but yeah, there's, again, most of these women are involved in struggles year round. If it's not the march, there is a lot of, because of COVID, a lot of sort of indigenous land struggles have also been brought to light. So, right now, just as we see in Palestine and colonial expansion and violence there, we were experiencing the same thing, for example, in Karachi, where these like luxury housing developments are kicking out, shooting at, bulldozing villagers, indigenous people who've been, yeah, and so yeah, a lot of the energies are there right now.
Actually, it ties on to a question from the audience. Louise Wedley said, "Congrats on the multi-protagonist narrative about a complex cast of characters and issues. Are you hopeful for the future of feminism and women's rights?" I guess that would be
Yeah, of
internationally and
course.
also in Pakistan.
Yeah, listen, we're I look to people younger than me, and they've got their shit together, much more than I did. So I think things are good.
Great. It's nice to end on a hopeful note. Thank you so much, Anam, for joining us, and may we continue the fight.
Thank you for the lovely chat. Bless you.
Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Salam. Bye. Thank you for joining us.